What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. I'm going to continue to examine 100 years of the greatest 150 black fighters of all times. Now, the image you see before you is not by accident. We're going to re-examine Sidney Walker, better known to you as Beau. He's to your left. But we're going to take a second look at what actually made Sidney Walker Beau. And what will help us to understand Beau better than we've known him before is to take a look at the image to your left. His name is Homicide Hank, better known to you as Henry Armstrong, who was the former 3 World Weight Division champion, the former 19 title defense welterweight champion, who, by the way, to this day, that record has not been broken. Henry Armstrong had defended his welterweight championship belt, 1939, 5 times in the month of October. He would win 27 fights in 1937, knocking out 26 of his opponents. The only fighter he didn't knock out was Aldi Spaulding. He would become the first black American featherweight champion in boxing history, and he would win that title from Petey Cerrone in 6 rounds in the Mecca, Madison Square Garden. And that was at a time when the only 2 black fighters that would win a title in Madison Square Garden would be Tiger Flowers, 1926, against Harry Greb, John Henry Lewis, 1935, against Bob Olin. But Henry Armstrong will be featured in this conversation because of his contribution to Sidney Walker, better known as Beau. Now let's take a look at Beau. His name was Sidney Walker. He was born April 1st, 1921 in Augusta, Georgia. He would transition February 9th, 2000. He was 78 years of age at the time of his death, and he would reside in Augusta, Georgia. Now he would fight between 1939 and 1955. He would have a total bout career of 121 bouts, 91 wins, 24 losses, 44 knockouts. He'd be stopped 4 times and have 5 draws. Now, Beau would be entered into the Boxing Hall of Fame in 1972 and the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1991, the World Boxing Hall of Fame 1986, and the Georgia Boxing Hall of Fame 1979. He would become the New York SAC lightweight champion when he would defeat Tippy Larkin for the vacant New York SAC lightweight championship belt. It was vacated by Sammy Yengott. And that fight would take place December 18th, 1942 in New York's Madison Square Garden. Now, Beau has quite a story. I've shared that story with you a few times on this platform. But as part of his memoir, you see, Beau used to work as a caddy in the golf course for Bobby Jones. And he was shining shoes for a living. And one day, as a young boy, Beau would come home to his grandmother's house, crying. She had a plate of food waiting for him. And when he came in the house crying, she wanted to know what he was crying for. Now, his grandmother lived to be 112 years old. She was very stern with her values. And she took a lot of pride in raising BoJack, getting him to understand what his last man and his last name meant to him. So as she's asking him what he was crying for, his response to her was that the boys stole her money. And when I say the boys stole her money, it's because BoJack would give his money to his grandmother to put up for him. She would give him half and hold half on the side. One of the values that she would teach her grandson, BoJack. So she asked him to repeat himself because she wanted to be crystal clear before he was going to receive what he was no longer going to receive as an exchange for what he now receive. And he said, the boys took my money. She told him to go into the back room, pull off your clothes. When he came back, she told him to go back into the room and get the long belt that was hanging on the back of that door. Now, BoJack obviously knew what that meant. But one thing you didn't do is try to talk your way out of a situation as a young boy or girl when it came to your parents back in his time. So he would bring the belt to her and she would give him the worst whipping of his life. That's quoted by BoJack. And in the syllables, she would explain to him, no walker runs from no one. And as I said to you, his name was Sidney Walker. That was not a metaphor. It was actually his name. And she made him go back outside and get his money. Now, when he refused, he did not get the food that she prepared for him. She made him wash his face and go in the back room. Now, the next day, BoJack would go back outside. Now, mind you, the jar of money that he had was taken out of the shoeshine box, and the polish that he had in the shoeshine box was taken from him. And what he couldn't understand before his shoebox goodies would be confiscated was the boy who actually confronted him already had shiny shoes. And that boy's name was Leroy. He was the neighborhood bully. Had about 2 guys with him. So the following day, BoJack, and understanding what it would be like going back into that house again, having the same problem he had previously, went to go look for Leroy and asked Leroy, to put down the box, and you and I got to take care of business here. We got to straighten this matter out. And Leroy couldn't believe what he was hearing. BoJack threw the first punch. And he would knock Leroy down to the ground, climbed on top of him, and start pounding his head to the concrete. He would go in the pockets of Leroy, take whatever money he can find, go back into the grandmother's house as though he won the Super Bowl, or in his case, the future lightweight championship belt, and telling her that he got his money back, and explain the details as to how that happened. Now, this would prepare BoJack for his next phase. He would get into a battle royale, have several fights in that mockery of a sport. One of the things that he found out, that if he was to tuck in the corner of the ring, because he was blindfolded as 6 other boys were, the first object that would come close to him, he would swing away, and he would normally be the last man standing. Now, Bojack would eventually start getting real about his life and what was important to him. And he wanted to make money because he realized schooling was not quite for him, as it was not for Joe Louis, many other young boys in his community. So he had to make something of himself. And he would do that very thing. On January 1941, there was a fellow by the name of Brown in Milligan who would meet up with the former three-weight division champion, who was a featherweight, then welterweight, then lightweight division, unified and undisputed champion. His name was Henry Armstrong. Met with him in New York. They would meet up in a bar restaurant that was located in Harlem, New York, 92 St. Nicholas Avenue. Now, Henry Armstrong was born in Columbus, Mississippi. He would relocate to St. Louis. He was passed through New York. And he would reside on the West Coast. He lived there from 1912 to 1988. I had the pleasure of meeting Henry Armstrong. And he told me several stories. Now, at this point, he wasn't quite himself. He was ill. But I learned a great deal from Henry Armstrong. He was in a wheelchair at that time. And he wasn't shy of explaining and expressing his life. And he told me what it was like growing up in his day. He told me what it was like fighting in the era in which he came. He told me what he had to go through and what he had to deal with as a fighter, let alone as a young man in his time. He told me about the Fitzpatrick fight. He told me about fighting Sugar Ray Robinson and Bojack and Tippy Larkin and Willie Joyce, Barney Ross and Petey Cerrone, Lou Ambers. Quite experience it was having a conversation with my number 4 greatest fighter of all times. Now, Henry Armstrong's father was Irish and black, and his mother was 100% Iroquois Indian. Full-blooded, I might add. He would capture the featherweight championship belt October 1937, New York's Madison Square Garden, from Petey Cerrone. Now, Petey Cerrone would retire after facing Sammy Aingat. And which was interesting because the same title that Bojack would fight Tippy Larkin for was a vacant strap of Sammy Aingat, who, by the way, they would call him the Clutch. Now, Henry Armstrong would win the welterweight title from Barney Ross at the New York Madison Square Garden Bowl, May 31st, 1938. And that was very interesting because they both had the same manager, Eddie Mead. And Henry Armstrong would try for the lightweight championship belt while featherweight champion. But Lou Ambers kind of moved around Henry Armstrong, took on another opponent. So Armstrong would move up to the welterweight division and challenge Barney Ross. Now, the reason why this was even done to begin with is because Joe Louis was the talk of the town. And Eddie Mead Now Jolson was trying to make the most of what they could of Henry Armstrong. So they had him win the featherweight challenge for the welterweight, which he would succeed in doing, and carrying Barney Ross for 15 rounds. But then he realized they had to find something else to get the audience's attention so that they can draw better box office gates. So on August 17th, 1938, New York's Madison Square Garden, they would face Lou Ambers. And the last 5 rounds of that fight, Henry Armstrong would swallow his own blood, because the referee would warn him that he was about to stop the fight because of excessive blood all over the canvas. And it was from Henry Armstrong. So Henry Armstrong asked for a second opportunity, and he would take out his mouth guard. He would swallow his own blood for the last 5 rounds of that fight. And then he would become a 3 worldweight division champion. That has never been done before. The year before, Joe Louis would win the heavyweight championship of the world. He would be the second black heavyweight champion in boxing history. And he would accomplish that feat in defeating Jimmy Braddock, Comiskey Park in Chicago. And that's why Eddie Meade felt as though he had to trump Joe Louis's accomplishments. But what wound up happening, 1938, you would have a black featherweight champion, a black lightweight champion, a black welterweight champion, and Henry Armstrong. You would have a black light heavyweight champion, and John Henry Lewis. He would capture that crown in defeating Bob Olin. And you would have a black heavyweight champion in Joe Louis. And this would change the game and how the promotions would now be dealt with. Henry Armstrong would wind up defending that welterweight championship crown 19 times. And as I stated to you before, he would defend his welterweight championship strap in 1939 in the month of October 5 times. Now, Henry Armstrong would have his issues in 1940 with the Pittsburgh veteran Fritzie Zivit on October 4th, 1940. And he would have problems once again on January 17th, 1941, both in New York's Madison Square Garden. He had 12,081 screaming spectators in that audience. In the 1940 fight. And on the undercard, a young man would have his professional debut. After becoming the 1939 featherweight champion and the 1940 lightweight champion in the New York Golden Gloves. His name was Ray Robinson Walker Smith. Now, during his last year as a professional, Hot Springs, Arkansas, Henry Armstrong would then train in New York's Stillman's Gym, at 57th Street and 8th Avenue, and that's where he would meet up with Brown. Brown would ask him to go to the restaurant with him, and they would have a conversation. And in that conversation, he would ask him if he would mind taking some time out of his day to work with a young fighter from Augusta, Georgia. His name was Beau, who was formerly named Sidney Walker. And Henry Armstrong thought that was interesting because he knew of a Walker. It turned out to be Ray Robinson, who was Walker Smith. So Henry would tell Milligan and Brown that Beau was a strong bull after working with him for about 2 weeks. He said, let me work with him, but let me handle him my way. And rest for sure, I can turn him into a lightweight champion of the world. And Beau was having his ups and downs in his career. He would lose 4 out of 17 bouts in 1941. But then he would become Henry Armstrong's sparring partner. And he would learn the tricks of the trade that would one day be used against his mentor, Henry Armstrong. But that would be okay, because the gold in this particular understanding and agreement that these two men would have is to one day make Sidney Walker a lightweight champion of the world. And he made that promise, and he wanted to carry out that promise to Brown. So that's where they were in their agreement and understanding. Now, what Henry Armstrong would eventually accomplish would be a miracle. Because Beau had a certain way about him that it was difficult to get him to adjust. And Henry Armstrong would be able to do that for him. Now, New York's Madison Square Garden. Beau would have 21 main event fights. And that would be a record at that time. The record would wind up being 23, and that would be Emil Griffith. And what was interesting about, at that time, Beau having 21 main event fights at Madison Square Garden, which was the most, he would take on the man who would have the second most main event fights in Madison Square Garden. That would be Tippy Larkin. Now would be December 18th, 1942. And Beau could not have won that at a worse time, because the war would begin. And the titles would then be frozen. But there were exceptions in certain weight divisions. So Beau would get tangled up with a Philadelphia fighter by the name of Bob Montgomery. And his fights with Bob Montgomery would be wars. Now, Beau would go back to his shoe shine business at the famous Fontainebleau Hotel that's located in Miami. And he would shine the shoes of Jerry Lewis and Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Milton Berle, Eddie Cannon, Louis Armstrong, Joe Louis, and Walker Smith, Ray Robinson. He'd be given $40, $100 in tips. But when you look at Beau career, it was really amazing, because Beau was a hell of a fighter. Now, he would defeat Chester Rico in 8 rounds in a unanimous decision. Bojack was 21 years old. He stood 5 foot 6 inches, weighed 134. Had a 68.5-inch reach. Had a record at that time of 46 wins, 6 losses, 2 draws, and 29 knockouts. As for Chester Rico, he was 25 years old. He stood 5 foot 8 inches. Had a record of 37 wins, 4 losses, 4 draws, and 12 knockouts. Henry Armstrong would turn Bojack's career around. In the first year of Bojack's career, now I've always called him a 1940s fighter, but he would actually have 2 fights in 1939. May 20th, 1940, he would have a 4-round draw. He would have over 16 fights that year. 3 losses, several knockouts. 1941, January 27th to be exact, he'd be in the ring with Mexican's Joey Silva. He would lose to him in 6 rounds. He would have 3 losses that year, but he would have over 20 fights. Many knockouts. And in that year, he would take on Tommy Spengel, Chester Rico, Al Reed, Freddie Archer, Sammy River. All big names during that time. 1942. He would take on Bobby Ivy, the young Irish boy. Fought him in New York's Madison Square Garden. He would defeat him in 8 rounds. And that got the crowd's attention. November 13th, 1942, he would take on Ali Schultz, and he would knock him out in 7 rounds. Henry Armstrong started to make an impact on Bojack's career. Because December 18th, that same year, 42, he would knock out Tippy Larkin, who was a favorite to win that fight. It was for the vacant New York SAC lightweight championship belt that was vacated by Sammy Angad. Oh, that was something else. That was something else. Bojack, who was intimidated by Leroy back when he was a young boy and didn't want to go back outside after he was demanded with a belt in hand by his grandmother, would now become the New York SAC lightweight champion of the world. February 5th and March 5th of 1943, he would defeat Fritzy Zivic, Henry Armstrong's vengeance. And Armstrong would be in a corner on the floor, and he'd be rooting on Bojack. Bojack would do him justice, as Ray Robinson would do Armstrong justice by defeating Fritzy Zivic. April 2nd, 1943. The very man that would train Bojack would now be in the ring on the opposite side of the corner. His name was Henry Armstrong. And he would lose to Bojack. May 21st, 1943. That's when Bojack would have his rivalry with the Philadelphia native, Bob Montgomery, New York's Madison Square Garden. And Bob Montgomery would lose the lightweight championship belt back to Bojack, because Bojack had lost his title first time they fought, Bob Montgomery. And it would both be in the U.S. Army. 1944, January 7th to be exact. He'd be in the ring with Lulu Castellano. Fought him in New York's Madison Square Garden. defeating him in 10 rounds. His name was Lulu Castellino. If I said Castellano, it was Castellino. In January 28, 1944, he would take on Sammy Yangat, the man who actually relinquished to Beau. And it would be a 10-round draw. Now, I want to do a second part of this video. So this should be a part 1. Beau Jack and his magnificent career. Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. See you in the next video.